My name's Tim. I work for the NACB, the National Association for Cannabis Businesses, as a salesperson. Today we have our moderator, Jason. Jason Cragholm is a 15-year quality and customer feedback industry veteran and the founder of QualScore, a brand reputation management platform for the cannabis and hemp industries that is revolutionizing the way business metrics are measured. Through the QualScore platform, businesses can collect reliable data and measure quality, safety, efficiency, and customer satisfaction to a universal standard so they can make better decisions, build loyalty, and win the marketplace. All right, Jason, sending it back over to you.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, Tim. Always great pleasure to being associated with National Association of Cannabis Businesses. Thank you, NACB, for throwing this great event. I'm on stage with some amazing people, and I'll introduce them all. Just wanted to say that we are here to talk about liberty and justice for all, the role of corporate ethics in promoting social justice, social equity virtual conference panel here. And so I want to introduce our panelists here. Amy McDougall, she's a compliance and ethics program commando, legal risk mitigator, independent corporate monitor, Fortune 500 and cannabis MSO focus. Amy is just a powerhouse in what she is, and we'll get more into learning more about her. Another person that we have on the panel is Shanita Penny. She's a cannabis entrepreneur and public policy advisor. She's internationally recognized management consultant with 20 years of experience helping Fortune 500 companies and startups solve complex issues and improve business performance. Pleasure to have her on stage. And Tom Nolasco, NACB attorney, partner at Hatcher, Nolasco and Fletcher, PLLC. I've had the pleasure with working side by side with Tom on some standards that we're setting within the NACB. But just getting into things, I just want you guys to understand these great people that were on stage, and we have a very important task in our lives, to really set our foot down on fairness and equality, and let's all figure it out together. And so back in the day, liberty and justice for all meant something very different at the time our country was founded. And centuries of jurisprudence and legislation has generally continued to expand the reaches of liberty. The concepts of liberty are delicately balanced for corporations. There is no entirely free market. Businesses are regulated to varying degrees in advertising, operations, governance, investment, and of course, even hiring. And so what I'm going to ask now is, how did corporations come to be involved in social issues? And I'm going to pass it over to Amy.
Thank you, Jason. Yeah, so rewinding to the very beginning, really here, going back to the early 1900s, we saw involvement in social issues as early as Barnum and Bailey, right? Starting with the circus and the issues of animal cruelty, issues of hiring people, whether it was the bearded woman or things like that. If you saw the movie The Greatest Showman, you kind of saw it was, made into Hollywood and fictionalized quite a bit, but the concepts of bringing people into the workplace and forming a business that has a lot of social issues around it. And that was, bringing entertainment to the masses and things like that. If you fast forward into the 40s, you get into companies like Johnson and Johnson making the people who need their products kind of be their first focus, right? People who need band-aids and surgical equipment and products for babies and things like that. Also with Milton Hershey, right, with the Hershey Company, not only building, a company that makes chocolate, but also the Milton Hershey School for Boys in the town of Hershey, and contributing to various initiatives and nonprofits and community foundations, in the 1940s in that area. But it wasn't really until the 70s when we get into real corporate social responsibility. And at that time, that whole social contract with corporations that we know from the Committee for Economic Development in 1971, that kind of made that social contract for companies, that they should provide jobs and economic growth, that they should operate fairly and with integrity and ethically within the community, and that they become more broadly involved in some of the social issues that impact the community. And then as we went forward from there, whether it was into the 80s with Aaron Brockovich and companies with environmental issues, right, and dumping in local streams and water systems, we see the advent of equal pay, right, between women and men for the same work. We see expansions under Title VII, and the jurisprudence just kind of exploded, incorporating folks into protected classes. And so all of those things, we saw the companies getting more and more involved in overlapping with social issues. Even in the 70s, remember Nestle had an issue with encouraging people to use formula, their formula over breastfeeding, right? Again, another social issue that led to a lot of discourse. And where we ended up was with social media being able to have these conversations and being able to implicate a company on where their stance was on a social issue very quickly over social media. Twitter is immediate, and whether you've been there and you wanted to tweet to the CEO of an airline, hey, why can't you get your plane fixed? I've been waiting here for hours. Or it's a poor quality pizza that got delivered. Uh, that's not necessarily a social issue, but the social dialogue has been happening so quickly. And we're seeing companies, whether it's the bakery in Utah that didn't want to bake a cake for a homosexual couple, or if it's Hobby Lobby with the birth control issue for their health coverage and their employees, this dialogue has been going on very quickly, and consumers can get the information about a company's ethical position and their corporate social responsibility very quickly. And that's made the corporations have to pivot. And it's really pulled them right into the center of the conversation, in addition to boycotting, right? It's easy for people just, we've seen this political on the right or the left, boycott this company because they're advertising on this network, or because they came out or didn't make a statement on a certain issue. So corporations are smack dab in the middle of this discourse, whether they want to be or not, and they need to be positioned to make an impact.
Yeah, that is so true. And if you could add anything to that, Shanito, and maybe uh, talk about what's happening in cannabis right now.
Yeah, what's interesting is that there has been an evolution of how quickly corporations decide to get involved, and whether they are reacting, right, or if they are initiating this type of response. But in the cannabis industry, what we've seen now are these siloed state markets that have essentially been created by the handful of companies that control that market. And we have not addressed things that we should as an industry, because it's been up to a corporation to do the right thing. And so, what we're seeing now is the integration of policy recommendations and actual legislation and regulatory and regulations that support companies addressing social issues, especially around criminal justice reform. And so we are excited to see that, we are not thinking about things like expungement and pardons after the fact now. We're thinking about it day one. And in some places, we are doing it even before we can set up the actual industry. So that's where we're getting it right. Where we are missing the mark is how we're actually handling social issues in real time. In the last year, we've actually seen the opportunity for companies to talk about what they are already doing, who they already are from an ethos perspective. But so many of those companies miss the mark in terms of just wanting to issue some statement, but not having anything to back up that statement, or any real teeth to how do you go beyond just saying, oh, I feel your pain, or I see that this isn't fair. We've got to go the next step, and the next step includes action. And when you think about the fact that we dropped the ball in that way, there are companies that are hundreds of years old that are still trying to figure this out. I mean, you look at Jack Daniels and the fact that that recipe for that whiskey, it was formulated by a slave. And because of the world that we were living in at the time, it was all right for a long time for Jack Daniels to just run with this, never giving the proper due to Uncle Nearest, who was the slave who came up with this formula that's kept them in business and I mean made them a global brand. And so now what you've seen is them go back and course correct, and not just in giving him his credit and paying his family the estate, but they've also increased their corporate programming to lend itself to diversity in their industry. And we saw the same thing with Unilever. Unilever acquired a manufacturer of black hair care products. But in acquiring that very successful business, they also contributed significant funds so that other small businesses, just like that gentleman, would have the opportunity to have distribution and world class manufacturing. All of the things that then actually help to diversify and empower people in an industry. So while it looks like we've got a long way to go, there are companies, there are industries that are still trying to figure this out that have been around for a lot longer than us.
Yeah, thank you, Shanita. That's awesome, and that's the great thing about what we're doing now is we're really taking a stand, and we're going to try and move this the right direction. And what it's going to take is us taking a stand today, and then continuing this fight next year, every quarter, bringing it up, talking about it in meetings, making sure that we keep this conversation going. So that's really the key. Um, Great that we're talking about it today, but let's talk about it tomorrow too. So I have another question. We hear the phrase corporate compliance and ethics all the time. What do those terms really mean, and how are they different from each other? And I'll direct that over to Amy.
Sure, Jason, thank you. I think there's been a lot of discussion today in the other panels about vocabulary and how important it is to use the right vocabulary, whether it's the difference between justice, equity, inclusion, diversity, or using the word marijuana versus the word cannabis, right? Or any of the other terms or for marijuana. I think vocabulary is very important. And yes, the words compliance and ethics for a compliance and ethics program in a corporation are often used together, but not really often discussed what the distinction between the two is. And the distinction is really that the compliance, we're lawyers, right? The compliance is the legal floor. What do we have to do to comply with a particular law? And we know that laws are driven by social policies, right? And social interests, whether it's tax law, different status, married filing separately, married filing jointly. Social issues are embedded in our laws. We as a society come up with our social values and we legislate them. But there isn't anything that requires a corporation to stop there. And one really good obvious example of that is we have a federal minimum wage, but many states have set a higher minimum wage, just again from a social policy perspective. Many states have added extra protected classes to their discrimination laws. For example, under federal law, obesity or smoking status is not a protected status, but it may be under certain states or jurisdictions' discrimination laws. So there's nothing that keeps a corporation. They know they must be compliant and meet the floor, but there's nothing that keeps them from setting a higher bar. And that's the ethics piece of this. And when you say corporate ethics, it's like, how do you know if a corporation is ethical? Well, it's based on what your values are too. You're benchmarking against what you value, and those shared values is a really important piece of this. So what's really key is for the corporations to take in uh, social equity, social justice as a core value in their business. And they set their own compliance requirements, internal compliance requirements to meet that bar because that is what they value. But the compliance piece in this panel is about that, going beyond what's compliant and going into what is ethics, right? What is ethical for them? What values they embrace as a corporation, and that they model their entire business operations around those values, that they have to be embedded in the culture, in the operations, in the third party relationships, that value of social equity and social justice, diversity, inclusion. All of that has to be embedded in that corporate values in order for that ethic to really drive corporate behavior and corporate action. And when it is embedded, like we see for individuals, whether you're embracing hashtag Me Too or the social equity and justice issues that are going on right now and have been since last spring in full force, as a person, some of the same actions you can take as a person, you can take within a corporation, and that corporate action, right? The corporation can't act on its own, it has to act through its people. But when you have shared values such as those, you can take actions that affirmatively move the needle on some of these social issues. And so it's important for corporations to set those values and define what they are, publish what they are, make the world know what it is that your organization values.
Yeah, yeah. It's like setting that commitment, right? And what I want to do is pass it over to Shanita. And do you see much of that happening in the cannabis industry, or are they following through with their commitments? And is there any like things where we should be improving?
5 years ago there was such excitement around how many women leaders were in this space, from an ownership perspective to the executive suite, right, the C-suite in these companies. And then we saw a report in 2019 that talked about the decrease in women in leadership and ownership positions in this industry. And I have to think that some of that is directly related to the fact that we haven't had, real commitments to being ethical first and foremost, and then to creating entities that go above and define and set the standard for what we as an industry are going to do to um, you know just demonstrate, integrity, demonstrate, high moral and ethical behavior. And so we again we have a long way to go. I mean, what we've done is created situations where it's so easy to just check the box, and then there's nothing to really assess whether you're having the intended impact, and where you are able to, kind of just check the box. uh, there's nothing in place that says we need to do things differently going forward. And so right now in Pennsylvania, the idea was to improve upon the Maryland process. And in Pennsylvania, you were awarded points for women owners, veteran owners, minority owners. And these classes were dictated by the state of Pennsylvania, right? So you had the federal, the basics, and then you had like a couple of Pennsylvania specific add-ons. But now that market is operational, when these companies are reporting their ownership each year, there's nothing that keeps them from replacing that original application team with the people that they wanted, right? And there are no repercussions. And we're seeing it done day in and day out. And I consider myself someone who's pretty savvy, not typically taken advantage of easily. But I had clients in Pennsylvania that committed to doing one thing. And once they were licensed and operational, they have done the complete opposite or done nothing. And there's, until we hold those companies accountable in a real way, because consumers kind of get a whiff. They're asking questions. They want to know who your owners are. They want to know who your board of directors are, who's working and investing in your company. Um, but the patients are limited in their ability to even boycott or react to a company in the way that they do in other industries, because they're so limited sometimes. In the District of Columbia, patients were assigned a dispensary for the first couple of years of that program. And so if that dispensary did something that you didn't like, or whether it was business operations or their ownership, what they're doing or not doing in the community, then you have to go pay to be affiliated now with a different dispensary. So we've got to really create opportunities for patients and consumers to hold these businesses accountable like they do in other industries and with other businesses. And we did see the cannabis industry and consumers step up, a couple years ago, when the young lady in San Francisco called the police on the young Black girl selling water. And, this was somebody who had come up in California. So there was absolutely a time when she wasn't 100% compliant, and actually, kind of made that her claim to fame. And those were the days when folks talked about, being in the basement and being in the gray area, and we propped these people up and we supported their businesses, all for them to turn around and then give this innocent kid a hard time. And again, the industry reacted. Dispensaries pulled those products. Consumers, put pressure on dispensaries to pull those products, and we have to see more of that. You don't see that in Maryland. You don't see that when a Maryland cultivator puts out a product, a strain of cannabis called strange fruit, right? And in their eagerness to connect with this community, they actually created, additional trauma for the patients in the Maryland cannabis community. This strain of cannabis was named strange fruit with no context. And so anybody who was raised in that time or is aware knows that strange fruit, right, was referring to the dead bodies that were hanging, right, during a period of time in our country where lynchings were regular. Okay, and we're in this critical time again where history is repeating itself, and this company does nothing to really again lead in the way that we should as an industry with this. If they had taken the time out to really put the campaign in place that would educate and then say, hey, the proceeds from this will benefit criminal justice reform or these communities that have been impacted, I think they would have gotten a totally different response. And even 2 years later, that same company continues to be problematic in Maryland. When consumers are talking about quality of product, price, or anything else, they're harassed by the owners and management of this company. Again, all after issuing this Black Lives Matter statement. But then when you don't like what a Black patient has to say about your company or your product, your PR manager responds, and by the way, all lives matter. So these are real examples. We talked about Jack Daniels and Unilever and some of these other companies, but we've got to call out bad actors in the cannabis industry. We've given them the benefit of the doubt. If your intention behind strange fruit wasn't to alienate an entire community, you did that, but you've not done anything to course correct. And you've only dug a deeper hole as it relates to walking the walk. So I know we're going to get to that a little bit later, but I just think that it's most important for us to, as organizations, go beyond what the minimum federal or state requirements are, and just to really, really give this industry a shot at being what we really can be.
Yeah, love it, love it, and that's what we're doing today. Is really taking a stand for social equity for all. Some of the things that NACB are doing is a lot, and maybe what Tom can talk about is a little bit of that what hard work that they're doing to help this situation. And Tom, stage is yours. And maybe Tom, are you on your?
All right. There's always one, and it was me this time that didn't hit the unmute button. So what the NACB does, part of what we do is create standards to increase, compliance, increase the legitimacy of the industry as a whole. So we've done standards for advertising. We've done standards for things as esoteric as cybersecurity and infused products. But we thought it was really important to develop some social equity guidelines in addition to everything that's been happening as well, that we will take, and we've already been consulted by different state governments like Wisconsin, like New York, when they're developing their policies. And we want to give them some guidance on what other states are doing and what best practices are as far as developing their social equity guidelines and what worked and what hasn't worked. So that's part of the push for our guidelines, part of the push for this conference, just in general.
Yeah, love that. And then in real like examples with interactions with the lawyers and everything that you deal with on a constant basis, like what is shaking out there?
Well, it's interesting in our discussions, just preparing for this segment. The lawyers on the panel, and then I went to law school first, and then I went to business school. And lawyers know that we have a whole array that's developed by each state Supreme Court of ethical regulations. They're called ethical rules, ER 1 point whatever to 12 point to 15 point. And so that's a whole nother subset of the law where the court actually regulates lawyers and what we can do and what can't do, things like confidentiality, candor to the court. Those are what Amy was talking about in the section between compliance and ethics. Those are what lawyers have to follow ethically. So there's already a set guideline of regulations, and you've got to follow it, or else you're in big trouble. You'll lose your license, and you can't practice law anymore. Then I went to business school, and in orientation, they threw out some hypothetical questions about ethical questions, and I sat back there just aghast because, and then I realized these business people, these corporations, they don't have these they don't have these compliance rules. They can kind of do whatever they want as long as it doesn't break the law, right? So, they don't have candor to competitors or this whole other, and it's tough. And part of the reason is because, listen, the courts can control lawyers. We've got a direct proximity to them. Companies are dealt with not by the courts, but really by legislation, and that's much harder to pass when they have really strong lobbies setting forth what they do and what they can't do. And it's still a big selling point is deregulate, right? So you're never going to have that entire framework guiding ethical actions of businesses and corporations that you will on the legal side. And that's the challenge, especially when, when Amy was talking about at the beginning, how did we get where we were? I mean, Milton Friedman, who a lot of people still follow and read, and it's taught in business school, his philosophy was what? Why do corporations exist? To maximize profit for the shareholders, right? That is still the ringing endorsement of why people are getting into this industry. Most of my clients got in from Wall Street because why? They saw the profit margins. And this is a growing industry, and you can make money here. And you can make money without following what you don't have to do. And a lot of times that's social responsibility. That's a CSR that Amy was talking about. And you'll do the bare minimum on that side. Now, the flip side, what Shanita and Amy were saying is, hey, it's not Milton Friedman's world anymore. You've got social media, and you've got everything else out there. I mean, what I wanted to say, businesses in business school, they always talk about what can you do to gain a competitive advantage. Well, today, by addressing your stakeholders, your employees, I mean, you're really looking for branding. And the way you get good branding and you increase your reputation, hey, do what the community is asking you to do. My good clients and the good owners and operators are out there. They understand and they've figured it out. If we invest in our community and address community concerns, community will take care of you. And so, I mean, if there's one message we can give to the big MSOs out there, it's this will help you. This will give you a competitive advantage. This will help your bottom line. And it's starting to catch a little fire, but the profit margins are always out there too. So it's still a struggle.
Yeah, it's a whole shift of business thought process, and it's going to take some time. So that's why we're going to keep this always on our mind, and that's the way to make this change. Shanita, how is the cannabis industry uniquely situated to not only hop onto the train, but to take over as engineer when it comes to influencing social equity?
I think we are uniquely positioned because there are actual opportunities, right? For the folks that want to diversify IT, those opportunities, especially from an ownership perspective, are limited. And then you've got these established kind of powerhouses that are still struggling with this issue. I mean, look at Facebook. Zuckerberg has figured out how to do so many things, and not yet has he figured out how to not only attract and retain diverse talent, but to then put that out to the world in a way that is received genuinely, and it isn't just patronizing. So there are endless opportunities in this space. And so when you look at what's happened in government contracting and the ability that has the result of government contracting in the Maryland and DC, Northern Virginia suburbs, right? You have three of the wealthiest African American communities in this country, and they're all in Maryland. And when you dial into how those families became successful, you'll see that a lot of them were affiliated with government contracting. And so the one thing that we know that exists with government contracting is accountability. If you say you're hiring, you get a government contract and you say you're hiring 50% women, 50% vets, and your reporting isn't that or better, right? They're fining you. They're snatching your contract. You blackball yourself. So we need to look at how we actually create these opportunities, but then also drive programming that supports, right, supplier diversity. We have mechanisms in every state to manage diversity and supplier vendor diversity, and we should just be leveraging that for cannabis. We should not be reinventing the wheel. So where we can take the years and years of experience in other industries and business and use that appropriately, but also be as open-minded as companies like Tom's, right, whose bottom line includes providing a pair of shoes for every pair of shoes that they sell. We have to start to approach this in that way. It can't be, oh, we still got issues with 280E. We still got federal legalization to fight for, so we want to spend our money there. It can't be that. When you come into this game, you have to identify, whether it's going to be people, whether it's going to be planet, or a combination of the two, that you're going to affect in a positive way, not just coming into our communities and selling us stuff. You don't even get the opportunity to play unless you're coming in to heal, right, the ills of the drug war. Now, for other industries, if we wanted to say, all right, let's look at what, housing and banking and healthcare and all of these other things, that may be your lane for addressing social inequity. But in cannabis, there are always going to be, patients that need access. There are always going to be folks that need jobs and need a chance, right? Because we've got people that have had cannabis convictions that have kept them from having meaningful employment and earning a livable wage. We've got to get away from positioning or presenting ourselves as the best thing smoking for the community until we get there and we leave folks high and dry. Think about the folks that are homeless because of what's happened in Colorado, and the fact that we're addressing social equity and equity in this industry so many years later. So I think that, again, we just have this huge pie that's still in front of us. And I can't remember who made the point earlier, but this is something I say probably every week. When you invest in the community, you stop having to take care of the community. When you invest in the community, and that's something that we have to remember, cannabis businesses are not going to solve all of the problems of these communities that prohibition helped to devastate. And so what we can think about is the fact that we've got, milestones like 100 million in tax revenue in places, and we have programs in place to now go reinvest that money. So again, I think the fact that we are just positioned well with this growing industry, and also that all of the stakeholders are finding a way to insert themselves and push themselves to the front. The regulators that just recently formed, the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission is the founding, and I guess it was their brainchild, but these regulators from the legal states have now formed an interstate regulatory commission, agency, body. So at least they're talking to each other and not just operating in these silos. So when California's pushing ahead with social equity, you're talking to folks in Colorado who are trying to figure it out and not going, in circles, not spinning your wheels and you know, being redundant in terms of the lessons learned. Actually identifying what's working, what's not working, and moving forward in a more effective and efficient way is where I see us really influencing social equity in a real way.
Yeah, I love it, Shanita. That's what we have the opportunity to do. I think that's what we all want to do. It's now we need to do it. And there are organizations like NACB that is setting these guidelines and helping us raise awareness. And that's what we're doing all day long today. We had amazing people speaking about this uh, problem. And I actually heard the last panelist talking about minority majority areas that people, um, employers can go work in and create that work environment and help that minority area just revive itself, because you're providing those opportunities in this great opportunity, which is the green rush, and everybody wants a little bit, but if we could be responsible about it, that'd be amazing. So I'm excited to be a part of this movement for sure. Um, in giving the landscape we have set, that companies can and should impact social issues, Amy, can you tell us some ways that companies can take these specific actions to influence moving the needle on social equity issues to create lasting results?
Absolutely. And I think that's the question that we kind of all have from today. What can I do as a person and what can my company do to really move the needle on the issues? How do we put into action, an action step tomorrow, what we've learned today, and put in with some momentum some of the points that Shanita had made? And earlier in the day, somebody said policy is not the only place, right, that we can move the needle on this. It's not just the policy that needs to be made legislatively on this. We can move the needle without the policy being in place. It's not the only way. And people do, somebody else said, I think it was Saskia this morning, or maybe it was Ernest, said, use your dollars in a way that support your values, right? And that applies not only to a person. I'm planning a wedding. I'm being very purposeful about what vendors I use, right, in and around Baltimore, because I want my dollars to support my values. And someone else posed the question, how do you make the right thing to do the easy thing? And I would argue usually the right thing to do is the easy thing to do. The hard thing to do is try to do something else, but make it look like it's the right thing to do. So I think the right thing to do is the easy thing to do. And because cannabis is such a new industry, piggybacking on what Shanita said, which was just the center of the target, is that there's an opportunity here for corporations to move forward and set the bar and pay attention to what the demand is, because the buying power that's coming of age right now, they care if the shirt was made in a sweatshop. They care if the coffee is fair trade or not. And those of us in later generations, that wasn't necessarily on their scopes. Either they didn't get the information about the companies and they couldn't make their decisions based on them. But nowadays, right, that information is freely available. And as a new industry, we can pay closer attention, right, to what the consumers are demanding and what the communities are demanding as a new industry. And we're coming from behind on legitimacy and credibility in the first place, right? So long as the product remains criminal at the federal level, then you're already fighting, right, for legitimacy and credibility. And the way out of that struggle for organizations and for the companies in this space is taking a stand on some of these social issues. So then the question becomes, where do you start with that? And I would say, if you're a company, you're here representing your company, start with your core values. What are your core values that you've established for the company? Shanita mentioned earlier people, planet. I worked with one company and their values were people, planet, and prosperity. They valued all three of those things, and in everything that they did, those three values manifested. And so I would say define your core values for your corporation, publish them, announce them, put them in your contracts. The first line doesn't have to be legalese in Times New Roman 12-point font with 1-inch margins. It can be our company values social justice. Our company values equality. Our company values liberty and justice for all, and our relationship as we do business will support those values of liberty and justice. So, values first. Second, at the very beginning of the life cycle, when you bring people into your corporation, right? The corporation is a legal entity in and of itself, but again, it can't act without people. At the very beginning, whether it's announcing what your core values are in your job announcements, the Amy company, this is what we value. Whether it's communication, integrity, business ethics, social justice, diversity, inclusion, all of those things in the job announcements, in the openings themselves, in the job descriptions, right? You're going to be required to read emails. You're going to be required to attend meetings. What else are you going to be required to do, right? Uphold the values of the company, right? Strive for and promote social justice, equity, inclusion, a voice at the table for the people who you work with. And so you can incorporate all of those values and all of these processes as you already may have them established in your company, but have you woven in what you really value in these what seem to be mundane processes? And then when you're hiring, you can't just let the needle swing all the way to the side and say, okay, well, we support social justice and social equity and inclusion and diversity, so we're only going to hire people of color from now on. Well, you can't really do that under the law either. But what can you do, right, to be mindful of that? Can you train on unconscious bias? Can you train on maybe name bias? That's a very prominent thing that people aren't aware that someone's resume might make them a little bit more uncomfortable because it's a name that they can't pronounce or a name that they have an association with. I'll share a personal story that I was doing some unconscious bias training and kind of a workshop in a continuing legal education and exploring maybe what unconscious bias I had. And what I came to realize is I had a bias against anybody with a long Southern drawl, a big, long Southern accent, particularly men with a Southern accent. And I don't live in the South. I've never known anyone I disliked that I could recall. But, I do think that when I've had this experience, and I would just shut them down and not want to know what they had to say. Well, as I explored this further, because I couldn't figure out why I automatically felt that way when I heard someone speaking that way, it was foghorn leghorn. Maybe if you're old enough, you remember from the cartoons, there was this enormous rooster who spoke I do declare, and I must not have liked his character, and it formed this unconscious bias in me. And now I have to purposefully, when I hear someone who speaks that way, tell myself that's not foghorn leghorn. And this person may have something very valuable to say. I need to listen. But for me, it was just a visceral reaction. And we all have that, just based on our life experience and apparently based on the cartoons that we watched. But things like unconscious bias in hiring, right? And looking at resumes uh, and moving towards incorporating those values in the hiring process itself, which includes asking people some uncomfortable questions. Have you ever felt left out of a team? What was that like for you? Did you tell anyone? Did you raise that issue? Why or why not? Right? We want a culture that brings people in who will fit, who will share our values. Are qualifications and training experience important? Sure. But you can get experience every day you're at that job. You're going to have more experience than you had the day before training. And you can pay to train anybody, right? The US military knows this. Nobody knows how to fire the weapon when they get there. They usually have to train them on it, right? And so those things can be learned, but the shared values piece is critical. If you have a workforce that's predominantly people of color, maybe the person with 3 Confederate flags tattooed on their neck is not the best hire for your company, right? Even if the resume looks great, maybe that's not the right fit. Maybe there's a values mismatch there. So I would say incorporate that into the questions that you ask people, right? You're interviewing them not just for the skills and the knowledge they bring to your company, but what values do they bring to your company? Ask them, here are our core values. How do you embrace those values in your life? How would you see yourself embracing these values in your day to day work? What types of things would you do that would be expressions of our values of inclusion or diversity? Or what have you. This isn't just the minimum Title VII compliance. So long as you don't outright discriminate against them, we're good. We're not. We're not good. We know that we're not good. And so I would say in that very beginning, in the hiring process and bringing people in, once people are in the company, how are you manifesting the values? What kinds of voices are being heard, right? As far as the inclusion. Are there town halls where we're asking people to speak up and share? Are there phone calls directly? Are there employee focus groups, forums? Is there a speak up culture? That's one of the most critical things for a company is an open door policy and a speak up culture. If there's a problem, does that employee feel comfortable stepping forward and saying, you know what, I think we have a problem here? Because in our culture, again, going back to when we were young, don't be a tattletale. Snitches get stitches. Don't be the rat. Why are you being a mole and you're spying on us, right? All of these have negative connotations. But the reality is, if you're a company and your corporate leadership, you can't fix what you don't hear about. Don't you want to know? You want your employees to come forward. So, are things being said in your company that are shutting that down? Oh, I don't want to hear that. How many people have gone to their manager with something and they said, "Oh God, I don't want to hear that," right? Train your managers. That language sends a subtle message. Or, let's just get this project done. I don't want to hear about any problems. I just want to hear that we got this done, right? Get it done at any cost. These are the types of things that get said that communicate a message where issues about inclusion and diversity, sexual harassment, right? They're not going to come up. The issues are not going to come up. So I'd say once you have people in the company and you've set the right culture, preserving that culture in an actionable way is very important. And I don't know what's flying around. The other thing I would say is those are internal things to the company. The policies that you draft, the values you incorporate, the people who you bring into the company. But there are external things you do too, right? Events that you can sponsor that support these issues, these social issues, nonprofit contributions. If there is political giving, supporting candidates that promote solutions to some of these problems. And then, most importantly, putting your money where your values are is third party contracting. Are you doing businesses with companies that also share your same values? Because if you don't, that's where we're going to have to part ways. I don't want to work with you if you don't support the same types of values that I do in business. And this is where cannabis, as it forages, right, these roots and branches and people working together and the interdependencies that will naturally form within states right now and eventually interstate commerce, that is so important. And it's only paid attention to in the outside sector when it comes to really Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, right? Are you contracting with somebody who's likely to pay a bribe? That's kind of the minimum bar we need to know and what kind of liability that would bring. Beyond that, I don't see a lot of commercial companies paying close attention to who they're doing business with, unless it'll bring them liability for conflict minerals or Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or product liability or lead in the product and things like that. That's where they'll draw the line, and that's a compliance issue. There's no reason why we can't elevate that. And again, cannabis being nascent as an industry is well positioned to learn from everything that's gone wrong in all these other industries and say, we're not going to do that in this industry. We're going to define a new path. And sadly, we're seeing people drop into the same potholes that other companies have fallen into. False reporting. Shanita, you mentioned changing the composition of the companies, and there's no accountability on the flip side for that. And you're right, in the federal contracting space, people get hammered all the time. False Claims Act, $2 million, $5 million, $8 million, and up of False Claims Act liability for not having that kind of accountability. So externally, the company can take actions external to the company that also manifest those values. And all of this is in the framework of a corporate compliance and ethics program, just as it's defined in the federal sentencing guidelines. And you shouldn't have a compliance and ethics program so that you're ready to talk about it if you're in front of a jury to reduce your sentence. That's really, you kind of want the program to work for you before you get to the point where you're painting it, the picture of your great compliance program to a jury. But the sentencing guidelines is where you will find the prescription, if you will, the requirements and the elements of a strong corporate compliance and ethics program. And its fundamental purpose is to prevent criminal conduct and misconduct and fraud. But beyond that, the corporate compliance and ethics program is leveraged to further the ethics of the organization and create a culture and business operations that further what that corporation cares about. And that's where cannabis is really uniquely positioned to define this right up front. And we don't have to fight off a legacy, right, on how things used to be. We don't have to turn the Titanic as an industry, whether it's the culture in pharma or the culture in the defense industry. Right? There's have cultures. We get to define the culture right now. And that's what's so exciting about being part of a new industry like this is taking those actions to make things go a different direction than they went for other industries, and really not only catch up on legitimacy and credibility as an industry, but we're all in this for one reason only. And I would argue it's not money, it's access. It's patient and consumer access to cannabis. That's what we all really want. And in anything that we can do in industry to shape it in a way to maximize and increase access is how all ships rise.
Yeah, that's amazing, and I love that. It set that foundation. I know that Shanita would say commitment and follow through, keep it going, and do it every day. And you know where we can look for advice and guidances to Tom and NACB on
That's right.
these things, right? Um, but you know if Shanita or Tom wants to add, please jump in. But I kind of want to follow up and say, what should companies not do?
That one is easy, right? Just don't be racist. Start with yourself. You can't create something in an organization if you're struggling internally, right? And Amy, that was such a good story because it is truly, it speaks to the innocence of some of these biases, and it also speaks to the necessity for you to be self-aware and then to do the work, right, to correct what is not working well for you. So I think for a lot of folks, it's not even that something like that happened, it's the lack of exposure too, right? When we think about media diversity and inclusivity in the types of characters that you're watching as a child, in the way that Black people in this country were portrayed for so many years before you had, the Cosby Show showing a middle class, Black, normal, nuclear family all under one roof. I've been to countries where people have asked me the most. I know it's lack of exposure for them, but I've been asked some of the craziest things because of the Black American that they've seen on TV. So we have to, every single person has to start look within yourself first, right? Because once you acknowledge that you have these biases, then you are able to do something about it. And the other thing is, be real, be true to who you are. If you are a company that's going to be uncomfortable with folks that don't look like you, whether it's gender or race or ethnic background, any of these things, religion even, if that's who you are, then you gotta say to yourself, I can't address this issue within my company. I need to bring someone in. And I'll tell you, a lot of these hires for diversity and inclusion are people that do not understand it except from an academic perspective. Get some diverse folks on your team to help address this. And they're going to tell you, I think that Juneteenth program might be a bad idea. You haven't really celebrated this before. There were so many companies, cannabis included, that wanted to, have a retail uptick because they were going to celebrate Juneteenth for the first time ever. And it's ridiculous to have that expectation around doing something right. Now, if as a company, you genuinely connect with a community and support that community, and they in turn support you with their dollars, then you're doing something right. But I implore you to really take a look at who you are individually and what your company represents, because I know that there are large to small operations, multi-state operators included, that struggle because when it's that C-suite and you got to try to convince somebody to do something they've never done before, it gets tough and it becomes personal. And so we've got to, again, just start with not being racist. Start there.
And I love that. And it's okay, everybody. It's okay. We have screwed up all across the board, everywhere. Everybody has been screwing up. And now it's a matter of us just to set it going in the right direction. It's okay that we have made mistakes. It is okay. But let's try not to keep continuing making those mistakes, right? And Tom, would you wrap us up with maybe a last statement? And this has been an amazing discussion. I wish we could talk forever about this, but no, we got to get out there and start doing this. Tom, you're the last to talk here.
Yeah, I mean, it's nothing. It's not a poignant wrap up. More of an answer to your last question of things not to do. And I know we're up against time, so I just quickly have two things, and they've probably been discussed in the other panels. But what we're seeing a lot of, and this was in a lot of other states before that I heard about, these social equity programs are just coming online. And like any other industry, again, the Friedman profit motive, right? What we're seeing a lot of the big, larger MSOs typically, but it's not just them, as I found out even in the last weeks, is they are looking for social equity applicants to partner up with. And then they will have side agreements with those applicants that are not favorable to the true social equity applicant. And that's really unfortunate. That's obviously against every public policy for all of these social equity programs. But you can do it, and you can get away with it if people aren't aware of what they're signing away. And I'm talking about social equity applicants signing away voting rights, equity rights, profit rights, or there's a sunset on their ownership. Those are out there. Those are being entered into unwittingly or not. And I think in the next panel we'll start to hear about people being approached. But listen, even here in Arizona, Prop 207 was passed, and so that's making us recreational. I've had clients and friends both ask me, "Hey, we hear that it's going to be there's going to be 35 licenses, right? We hear that there's going to be some preference to these social equity applicants. What's that all about?" So it's human profit nature, right? That's happening. So don't do that. Don't look for people and form a side agreement that is disadvantageous to the real social equity applicant. And then the second thing, and this is almost even a more challenging problem, is we hear, and we use it as a lobbying effort, say you should legalize because the tax revenue you get, you can devote to things like social equity, schools, roads, education. The problem is, and it's not exclusive to the cannabis industry, but it's where does the money go? Where does the revenue go? Does it go into the general fund? The NACB's social equity guidelines and what we're telling and consulting with the governments, you need to set up a separate fund, right? Because one of the most important things is, hey, this is a big person's game now, and you need a lot of money. You need $1 million to really get on your feet and to see if you can succeed. So the loan programs that we're promoting within our guidelines need to be funded. And you cannot take the tax revenue and put it into the general fund. You need to set that aside and be responsible with the tax revenue and make sure it's going to the appropriate social equity program that's been established in your state. So those were the two quick things. And I think I probably took us over time, but appreciate it.
That's okay, Tom. Yeah, thank you all for joining us. I just want to say thank you so much to Amy and Shanita, Tom, and really the ask here is let's take a stand, let's commit to it, and let's follow through, and we can all do it together because it's an interesting color when we actually get all mixed up together. I don't even know what that looks like, but it'll probably look like cannabis, So thank you all and enjoy your day.